All right, so we are we finished Psalm 115 2 weeks ago, so we're at the beginning of 116. If you are using this Siddur, it's at the bottom of page 52. People want to shout out pages in other books so that we can all be on the same, or has everybody got it? Everybody's got it. Okay, great. Um, so begin. So this is again. So the first part of Psalm 116 is skipped on those days when we only do what's known in Hebrew as the Hatzi Hallel, which means half Hallel, but it's really more like three quarters Hallel. Um, but Rosh Chodesh is actually one of those days when we don't do the full Hallel. Um, so let's look at Psalm 116. Again, I'll do what I've been doing mostly, which is um, my own translation with the help of the translation in the book, or the translation in the book corrected, by my own belief about what they mistranslated or, infelicitously translated. So, and this is hard because the text in Hebrew is fluid. Um, there first of all, there's no present tense in Hebrew. Um, so especially in biblical Hebrew. So it's not always clear what text is intended. For example, if you look at the very first word in Psalm 16, it says ahavti, right? And if you know just a little bit of Hebrew, right? Ahavti means what? I love,
Okay.
right? I love. But the translation says I love, right? Not I loved, I love. Um, and probably actually a correct way of translating this. So it's a little this Hebrew is, I mean, even though each word is not necessarily difficult, um, tenses and how to put it together is not always all that simple. Okay, so Ahavti ki yishma Adonai et koli tachanunai. Um, I, I loved that God, but Yishma is in the future tense, right? Um, but so here the translation here says, I love knowing. Eh, I don't know where the no comes, right? But I love that Adonai hears my voice and my plea, my supplication. All right, but all right, so the idea is clear, right? I know that God is going to hear my prayer, and I love that. He ta ozno li. He inclined his ear to me. U biyamai ekra. I call out during my days. Okay. Again, the translation here says days of need, so it's filling in some gaps. Again, not bad, right? So I know that God hears my prayer, my plea. God inclines his ear to me when I cry out. Afafuni havle mavet, the hordes of death have surrounded me. O mitzare she'o mitzauni. The the depths of Sheol have found me. Sheol, right, in the Bible, there's kind of this vague concept of an afterlife. And that's Sheol, where you go, and apparently, like, either both good people and bad people go there, and it's not really clear what happens. But the depths of Sheol have found me, right? So death has surrounded me, right? In other words, I mean, if you get rid of the poetic language and the metaphors, you know, I was I was at death's door, which I guess is also a metaphor, right? But I was at the verge of death. Sarah v'yagod and sa. Trouble, and I have found only trouble and agony. Uvashem Adonai Ekra, I call out the name of Adonai. Ana Adonai Malta Nafshi. Please, Adonai, rescue my soul. Hanun Adonai Vitzadik. God is gracious and righteous. Eloheinu Merachem. Our God has compassion. Our God has mercy. That word Merachem, so that's an active verb, right? I mean, we know the word Rachamim, right? Or in Yiddish, Rachmanis, right? But it actually comes from the word Rechem, okay, which means womb. Okay, so compassion is the word for compassion is related or derived from the word for the womb. Okay, why?
Because mothers have compassion for their children.
Mothers have compassion for their children, right? That's kind of like a natural thing, right? As a mother who would not have compassion, we would consider that sort of right bizarre and unnatural. It also means, right, that there are feminine metaphors for God, right? I mean, they are rare. They are rare. But rare is not the same thing as non-existent, right? And here is a if it's not exactly a feminine metaphor for God, it's at least God is described as having a characteristic that is derived from the word for a womb. Shomer Petaim Adonai. God protects the simple. Okay, and so God protects the simple, and in rabbinic parlance, I mean, sometimes when they want to say maybe it's not so great to be so knowledgeable, right? Shomer Petaim Adonai. God protects the simple, right? God protects the simple. Daloti veli Yehoshia. I was brought low. Dal is like low or lowly. I was brought low, and he rescued me. He granted me salvation.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a place where God says, as a mother comforts her children, so I will comfort you. And so that's also, he doesn't say a father, he says a mother. So that just made me think of that as well.
Right. And it's the same word. Kerachem em albani, right? Kerachem, lerachem is to have mercy. Okay. So yeah, so I absolutely, like, right. As I said, it's not, there are feminine references, feminine metaphors, for God. They're, not as, common as male references, but they do in fact exist.
Rabbi,
Shuvi nafshi lemenuchaychi. Okay, so well, okay, so return my soul to your resting place, but like resting place, not in the sense of like grave, right? Literally the place where you rest, okay? Return my soul to the place where you rest, or just return my soul to rest. And this minuchaychi, this is an archaic form of Hebrew. Okay, so I would say this would show that this is a fairly old text. And then also the last word on the line, Ki Adonai Gamal Alaychi, because God has had compassion on you, Alaychi, right? A less archaic Hebrew instead of Alaychi would be Alayich. But it says, all right, so my soul be at rest because God has had compassion on you. Ki chilatsta nafshi mimavet, you have rescued my soul from death. Et einai mindima, my eyes from weeping. Et raglai mi dechi. Okay, you have my rest, you've delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, from weeping, my feet from stumbling, right? So a whole, again, this is a parallelism of sorts, the feature of biblical poetry, right? Et halech lifnei Adonai ba'artzot haim. I will walk before Adonai in the land of the living. I will walk before Adonai in the land of the living. Ha'amanti ki adaber, ani aniti ma'od. I kept my faith even when I said, I am greatly afflicted. Ani amarti bechofzi, I said in my anguish, my chipazon, I don't like really anguish. My confusion, kol ha'adam kozev, all men are liars. And I think it doesn't just, like, by men, it doesn't just mean male. I mean, women might have a different perspective on that, right? All men are liars, but although it's interesting, right? I mean, well, I don't know. Just let's stop for a second. If there are any questions or comments on anything that we've looked at so far. Yes. So
I just wondered, back in the days of the temple or before then, when the people recited these psalms, Did they actually pronounce God's name at that point, or did they say Adonai?
Um,
Because I had heard, I didn't say somewhere that only the high priest pronounced God's name. So if that was the case, I just wondered what they would put in here.
right. I mean, that was certainly the case in the temple, sort of the second temple. I mean, you know, all right, so two things. A, I'm not an expert in this, okay? But I would say it is very hard for us to know. I mean, the the texts capture the writer's sense of how things should be, right? Not necessarily how they were. Um, I think having said that, especially the way it is described in the Mishnah, um, that probably by the late Second Temple period, um, they did not say the name of God. Okay. I mean, as evidenced by the fact that the exact accurate pronunciation is lost, right? Nobody really knows or can say with any confidence that we actually know how it was pronounced. But the Psalms, um, like I said, the Psalms are an analogy, right? And clearly, um, a lot of them are earlier even than the first temple, let alone the second temple, right? Because if they're ascribed to David, right? The first temple was built after David's death, right? It was built by Solomon, who was David's son and successor, right? So, um, I don't know, okay, but I would not be surprised if at the time that this psalm was written, they did say the name of God. And the idea that it should not be pronounced was, much, much later. I mean, if you think about it, the time from so David, I mean, from King David to the late Second Temple period is almost 1,000 years. I mean, we and I've harped on this before, right? But we often have this sense of like way, way back there, as if it's an undifferentiated period of time, right? But if you look at, um, like Rabbi Akiva, for example, right? From Moses to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Akiva to us is roughly the same amount of time. I mean, there's a lot of time there, and so it's a long way of saying I don't know. But my best guess is that um, at the time that the Psalms were written, and certainly the Psalms that are clearly pre-temple, God's name probably was pronounced.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Toby.
Yeah, I have a question about translation.
Yeah.
in that last sentence that you read, you translated as all men are liars,
Yeah.
but in the prayer book of God, that it's a little more subtle. It says all mortals are undependable.
Uh-huh.
Isn't, I mean, that seems like a big difference to me.
Well, all right. So the word, okay. So first of all, mortals, I mean, right, literally the word mortal comes from the Latin, right, meaning that, you die, right? So
Hmm.
like, right, so that mortals are different from God, right? Because God doesn't die and mortals die, right? But the Hebrew is Adam, right? Which means human beings.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, I mean, it's usually translated as men, it could be translated as people. To me, just saying mortal is like, I don't know, maybe more appropriate for liturgy, right? I mean, you know, and and this is an important point. I mean, um, particularly if you assume that the translation itself is going to be read in worship, right? You might want to sacrifice a little bit of accuracy for something that reads better, like in worship, right? I mean, it's not a big issue for us as conservative Jews since we tend not to use a lot of English in our service,
Hmm.
right? A bigger issue for Reform Jews who do use a lot of English in their service, and a huge issue for Christians. Okay. And I mean, I know this also because my mentor was a member of the committee of the U.S. Catholic Church that was responsible for producing the Bible translations that would actually be used in church, right? I mean, they don't have ritual committees that decide which book you're going to use in each individual church like we do, right? Or, well, you're going to use the A page or the B page. What? No. The bishops' conference tells you, right? And there is an official translation. And so, he would discuss that with me, right? I mean, if we translate it this way, it's a little bit more accurate, but it doesn't sound as good, right? It doesn't, and so there are trade-offs. But the word Hosev literally, I mean, I said liar.
Yeah.
That is actually, I went too far in the opposite direction. Okay, because liar is really shakran. Okay, a sheker is a lie, right? Kozev is deceitful, right? Deceitful, or what did you say? Unreliable,
Undependable. I mean,
undependable.
that's the
Okay,
word that I was really concerned about.
And
right, and
and
so
That
here in the more
that
recent Shin Shalom, it
adjective.
says mortals cannot be trusted.
right.
Okay, um, I I mean, none of these are wrong exactly, but I think so. When I said liars, that was too strong, right?
Okay, I'll go with that.
Undependable or cannot be trusted is not strong enough, I
Uh,
think. Okay, so really, I think the best translation would be deceitful, right? Deceitful. But what I'm interested in, because I've thought about this a lot, right? Because we gotten this several times a year, right? I said in my um even in my anguish, right? Let's assume, and I don't know what does the translation you have, what does it say?
For that phrase.
Yeah, Ania Marti Bechosi. Right, read the whole line.
Well, I'm not quite sure where the one that we were just talking.
Right before you said all mortals are,
Okay,
unreliable.
undependable. Okay, the translation is I keep my faith even when greatly afflicted, even when the panic I cried, even when in panic I cried out, all mortals are undependable.
Okay, right. Actually, the Hofsi in panic, I think, is actually a good translation. That's kind of the word I was looking for. Um, but so I'm in panic, so I say all mortals cannot be trusted. I'm not sure how this fits in with the rest, right? Because I mean, the whole thing here, right? That I mean, the thrust of the 11 verses that we've read is God is trustworthy, right?
Right.
God is trustworthy. And now we're saying, I trusted in God even when in panic I said, human beings are deceitful, human beings are unreliable, human beings cannot be trusted. I don't know how that goes with it, right? I mean, like, in other words, as I read it, right, I said in my panic, right, is like things you say when you're panicking, like you often later regret, right? And why would the narrator here regret saying mortals are undependable, right? Because the contrast is with God, right? God is dependable, mortals are not. Right. So I don't I find that particular phrase puzzling
It
personally.
would
Yeah,
make,
Leslie.
yeah, it would make more sense if he said, I kept my faith even when I said God is undependable. In other words, in a panic, because he thought he was going to die, maybe he said something, against God. That would make
Right,
more
but then you wouldn't
sense.
have kept your faith.
Well, no, he's saying, despite the fact that I said that, I still kept my faith. I mean, I really
Okay.
didn't. I said that, but I didn't really believe it, or something.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I get you. I get you. So I don't know. I have no answer. I mean, I just find this phrase doesn't fit with the whole rest of the psalm. Um, I don't know. Now, again, I mean, I don't have the knowledge to, go look and say, I mean, are there variant readings in other texts, right? I mean, does the Samaritan text read differently? Do the Dead Sea Scrolls read differently? Does the Septuagint read differently? I don't know. Okay, and we're looking at a Siddur, not like an academic Bible, which might have a footnote and it says in the Septuagint, da, 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 right? Because sometimes, do you all know what this? When I say Septuagint, I mean, is that Greek to you? I mean, Septuagint really is Greek to you, right? The Septuagint is the Bible translation that was created by the Jewish community of Alexandria. Okay, Alexandria during the Roman Empire had a massive Jewish community who Many of them did not know Hebrew. Okay. And so there was a need to create a Greek translation of the Tanakh, and that's the Septuagint. And um, the Septuagint was like Paul's Bible was the Septuagint, and the Septuagint became the Bible of the early church, right? And sometimes when the New Testament has a quote from the Bible and it's a little different than what we know, it's because it is the Septuagint and not directly from the Hebrew. Um, but sometimes, I mean, what you can do, and I'm not saying that applies here at all. This is just like in general. You can look at the Septuagint and sort of retranslate that back into Hebrew, right? And then you can say, obviously, right, the the person or people who translated the Septuagint, this must be what the Hebrew text that was in front of them read. Okay, so is it possible that this text is somehow garbled or corrupt? I don't know. I mean, I could look at the Septuagint. It wouldn't help me very much because I don't read Greek. Um, but there's always a, a possibility. Not that it matters that much. It bothers me a little because this text seems to, be so um, different than the whole rest of this song. Um, but obviously it hasn't bothered me enough to like do something about it. All right, so let's move on to the rest of 116. Ma'ashiv ladonai kol tagmulohi alai. Again, tagmulohi. This ending. This is an archaic Hebrew. Okay. How can I repay? What shall I give back to Adonai all of the good things that He has done for me? But when I say good things that He has done, in other words, like they're gifts, they're not earned, right? They're gratuitous. They're completely, gratuitous. They are unearned. I did not earn them, but God gave them to me anyway. Kos Yeshuot Esa, I lift the cup of salvation. Uvashem Adonai Ekra, and I cry out the name of Adonai, right? And now this appears in the Havdalah, right? Kos Yeshuot Esa, Uvashem Adonai Ekra. I lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of God. Nadarai Ladonai Ashalem, I will repay, I will make good my vows to Adonai, Negdana Lachol Amo, in the sight of all his people. Yakar be'enei Adonai Hamavta Lachasidav. Grievous in the sight of Adonai is the death of his faithful ones, right? When God's faithful die, this is very grievous in his sight. Ana Adonai ki ani avdecha. Please, O Lord, for I am your servant. Ani avdecha ben amatecha. I am the servant, the son of your maidservant. Pitachta lemosera. You have released me from bondage, from the um, chains that have kept me tied up, however you want to translate it. Now, Ani abdecha ben amatecha. I am your servant, the son of your maid servant. Okay, now, and some of you may know this, some of you may have asked me this question, right? But, right, when we say a mishaberach for somebody, right, the name that we use, to the extent that people know it, and people don't always know the Hebrew names even of their parents, right? But right, it right normally, right, forgetting, right, bracket the question of egalitarianism and so on and so forth. Bracket that, okay? Your Hebrew name is your name, son or daughter of your father's name, right? But for the Mishabera, it is your name, son or daughter of your mother's name, right? Why? This verse, right? Please, God, rescue me. Ani avdecha ben amatecha. I am your servant, the son of your maid servant, right? So when we're pleading to God, right? Right. It says, I am your servant. It doesn't say I am your servant, the son of your servant. It says, I am your servant, the son of your maid servant. And so it is this verse that is the reason that we use the mother's name and not the father's name in the Mishabara. It's purely based on this text. I mean, you could certainly um, adduce, all kinds of psychological reasoning behind it as well, right? I mean, mother being more naturally compassionate than a father, um, you know, uh, mostly, I don't know other people, but like the stereotype, right, is that like when you're really in distress, you call out for mommy, not so much for daddy, right? Uh, and certainly, I mean, oh my God, there've been, unfortunately, cases of people being murdered by police, choked to death by police in this country, and they're calling out for their mothers. They're not calling out for their fathers, right? So maybe this, you know, reflects a sort of psychological reality as well, but the textual source for that practice is here. Laha ezvach zevach todah. I will sacrifice to you a thanksgiving offering. Uvashem Adonai Ekra, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. Nadarai Ladonai Ashalem, I will repay my vows in the sight of Negdan Alacholamon, in the sight of all of his people, that is saying God's people. The Hatzrot Beit Adonai, in the courtyards of the house of Adonai. B'tochechi Yerushalayim, in your midst, O Jerusalem. Hallelujah. Okay. Right. So again, to go back to my puzzlement over the last verse of the first half of the psalm, my puzzlement is only strength, right? Because we're talking about, right, God being reliable. I'm going to attempt to repay what God has done for me, but that's not really possible. But I will, praise God, and, repay my vows in the midst of the people in Jerusalem. Questions or comments on this?
It says grievous in Adonai's sight is the death of the faithful. How does the author know that? I mean, we would like to believe it, but
Yeah, I like to believe it, right? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, when we talk about God, right, how do we know anything about God,
right.
right? I mean,
Light of the world.
He's attributing a sentiment to God that we would all like to believe is true. But it's it's also just like it's a deviation from everything else. Talks in the first person.
right, because mostly it's talking about what we do, right? Whereas here, this is talking about what God does, right? But
Mm.
right, but if you look at the first verse of this psalm, right? I know that God listens to my cry of supplication, right? How do you know that? Right? I mean, look, I mean, your point is quite valid,
Yeah.
right? And I probably get this question more often than you do, right? Why does God do this, that, or the other thing? Or why does God fail to do this, that, or the other thing? Or does God really care? Does God really care if I wait 3 hours or 6 hours to have dairy after I, ate meat? Or does God, and I don't know. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I can tell you what the tradition says, right? I cannot tell you what God thinks, feels, wants, desires, right? I can tell, I believe that the tradition is the closest approximation that we have to that information. But that's the best I can do. Now, having said that, the same words can have a very different valence if they are being asked in a class versus in a counseling session, right? If they are being asked in a class versus in a shiva, right? And so, I'll give an academic answer in a class. I try not to give an academic answer in another context, right? But how do we know anything about God, right? How do we know anything about God? We don't. We know what the tradition says. Yeah, Leslie.
Well, that's weird what you said, Joe, but also God causes the death of
Right.
everyone.
No.
I mean, so why would he grieve if he's calling, if he's causing the death of someone too? That doesn't sound, that doesn't make sense either.
Well, I have two responses to that. One is that I'm not sure that, I mean, I'm certainly not sure that, I mean, again, the assumption that you're working with in that statement is that everything that happens was caused by God, right? Which,
Well, he said he creates peace and he creates evil.
right.
So he creates everything.
Right. In that, but the Bible is an anthology too, okay? I mean, it's not, right. I mean, there are different books of the Bible, different prophets who have different perspectives, right? And all right, it is certainly a legitimate biblical position that everything that happens is caused by God. It's not the only biblical position, and it's not the only Jewish position, right? I mean, which gets us back to the whole question of, if it, do we have free will? Well, this is actually, we looked at this in the Pirkei Avot class, because we read in Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Akiva says, Hakol tzafui v'reshut nituna, right? Everything is foreseen and free will is given. Okay, now, right, in other words, if God knows the future, then God knows what decision we're going to make. Let me finish. And if God knows what decision we're going to make, then we don't have free will, right? But Rabbi Akiva resolved that problem by saying, yes, we do. To me, that doesn't really resolve the issue, but yeah, Leslie.
But I those are two different things. God can see what you're going to do. That's foreseeing it, but he didn't cause you to do that. That's your free will. So I don't see
how do I have free will if, right, all right, I am going to wake up tomorrow morning and have 3 cups of coffee, right? And God knows that, right?
But he didn't cause you to do it. So
he did cause it because it hasn't happened yet. So
but he knows what's going to happen in the future. But he didn't make you do that. You had the free will.
So then am I free to not have 3 cups of coffee tomorrow morning?
Yes, but he'll know if you're going to do that or not.
Then I don't have, I'm sorry. If God knows what I'm going to do, if God knows, it's not that God knows the variety of possibilities that are open to me. God knows what I'm going to do. And if God knows what I'm going to do, then I am not free to not do that.
I don't see
it
that way. I think they're two separate things completely.
Well, so you agree with Rabbi Akiva, and I think Rabbi Akiva is just resolving a problem by simply declaring it resolved. But at any rate, I don't think that in this verse, when it says that the death, first of all, that the death of his pious ones is grievous in God's eyes, that he necessarily causes their death. I mean, they could be murdered by evil people. They could be murdered by Philistines or Canaanites or Egyptians or whatever. So I don't think that the assumption is necessarily that everything that happens is caused by God. But even if it is, look, I mean, I don't know if you have ever made the choice to have a pet euthanized, right? I have. Okay. I made that decision. It is still very grievous in my sight. So even if it was caused by God, it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily, like a painful thing. But anyway, all right. We will pick up in the fall with Psalm 117. And thank you very much. This has been fun. And Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Night.
Shabbat Shalom.
Hi, Marcia.
Marcia.